So I'll be introducing Elizabeth Carpenter, who we're very pleased to have. So like I said previously, Elizabeth is the managing principal of JFMT Studio in Sydney. And throughout Elizabeth's career, almost 25 years at FJMT Studio, she has always been interested in the typology of education, both school and tertiary, and the impact of built environment on the learning environment. As managing principal of FJMT Studio, she has worked across many project types, drawing upon this diverse experience to inform new typologies such as the high-rise high school. This is a sustainable concept in a contextual approach that is driven by client's vision, and brief, as always, is the driver of FJMT's educational projects. Elizabeth's specific school experience evolved out of the design and construction of two major international schools in Singapore for the Cognitus schools, an independent provider working in conjunction with local practice. These mega schools, one an addition to an existing school, and one an entirely new school community with student populations up to 3,500, started an interest in the design of dense multi-level urban schools. An active advocate for the profession, Elizabeth is currently on chapter council for the Australian Institute of Architects in New South Wales, and she is involved with the practice committee. Through both her work at FJMT and also more broadly within the profession, she is always seeking to improve how architects work. Not unlike education, she sees architecture as a whole of life experience and is always interested in ways in which architects can engage with the broader community. So I'd like to introduce Elizabeth.
Great, thanks a lot, Charlie. And thank you all for the invitation to discuss with you our involvement in this new high-rise education phenomenon. As an architect, education is currently a really exciting and rewarding space to be in. All states in Australia are committing to a really extensive construction programs, up to billions of dollars worth of construction. As a practice, we're really fortunate to be involved with Schools Infrastructure New South Wales, new inner Sydney High School, which is actually their second high-rise school currently under construction in Sydney. This new typology of high-rise schools presents a new challenge. Not only are we exploring new built forms, vertical as opposed to horizontal, but we're also looking at new ways of learning, with the majority of educational providers, be they public or private, launching themselves into the 21st century and designing spaces to facilitate future-focused learning. As part of this process, there's a few really important questions that we need to explore. The first one is, what has been the catalyst for the emergence of this new typology? The second, what is the relationship between the new pedagogical methodologies and the built environment, and ultimately what actually does a future-focused school look like? How can clever spatial planning, developed out of a set of educational and design principles, provide an appropriate framework for a school which can be adaptable into the future? And in this context also, how can we actually learn from lessons of the past as well? And look, specific to the inner Sydney High School, how can we provide a flexible framework while responding to the reality of a highly constrained site and the pragmatic requirements of a large complex building? The interesting thing about these high-rise schools is all the, I suppose, the benchmark data which the departments of education in the various states have is always based on horizontal schools, not on vertical. So there's a whole lot of, as you know, a whole lot of other aspects which have to go into a vertical building, such as, smoke exhaust, lifting, things like that. So how do we actually, I suppose, wrap that into current budgets and also, I suppose, briefs which are pre-formed by these departments. Using the inner Sydney High School as an example, I'll try and give you some insight into how we as a practice started to investigate these issues. A quick background so that you can understand our context for this new school typology. FJMT, we're the head design consultant for this project, following a successful design competition, which came out of an extensive EOI and RFT process, which actually commenced in 2015. The competition was informed by work which was done by the New South Wales Department of Education, DWP Suitors and New Learning Environments, who are educational consultants, on the development of a framework for a new vertical campus, and that formed the basis of the brief, which we then took into competition mode. We were awarded the commission at the beginning of 2017, and now we're approximately 2 months into a D&C contract with the main contractor, who's Hanson Yuncken. And on 2 days ago, they just started doing the first excavation, which was pretty exciting. Our brief is for a comprehensive co-educational high school of 1,200 students. The school will serve the local area, and it provides relief for the many high schools which are either at capacity or nearing capacity. We don't yet know who the school community will be, but it's essentially going to be the inner city students who live in the adjacent suburbs. They're still working out what the boundaries are. It's primarily a school for the community, and this will, and I suppose the reality of who the community are will be evolved once the new principal is announced, which is actually quite soon because the academic year is almost finished. An important aspect of this school is that, similar to other major schools that the New South Wales Department of Education are developing with new pedagogical approaches, is that the principal will actually have the opportunity to handpick their staff, which is actually very important because what it means is then that the staff will be completely engaged with the model, which is actually probably, it will be the success of this school. The new inner city high school is the second high-rise school to be developed by New South Wales Department of Education. The first, which is the Arthur Phillip High School by Grimshaw and BVN, is actually a transformation and then an expansion of an existing school with a new 17-storey tower to accommodate 2,000 students in the tower portion. Arthur Phillip is actually quite different from this school because here we are actually working with the theoretical model. At this point we have no staff, no students, so it's actually in itself it's really quite an interesting exercise to sort of go through that process. In order to understand how this new typology could be developed and then adopted, we worked with the educational specialists, New Learning Environments, and also the experts from Department of Education who've actually been obviously thinking very deeply about this sort of how they approach future-focused learning. They're actually currently rolling out a number of quite large schools, usually within existing communities with similar educational models. But the inner city high school is actually the first one, which is vertical. A number of the feeder primary schools are actually using aspects of the model in their learning now. So it starts to, I suppose, introduce this student-centred transdisciplinary approach to teaching and learning with the younger years. So once they come through into the high school, there will be a certain level of familiarity. Most of the schools which the Department of Education are rolling out now with this new model, they actually also will have their hand-picked staff as well. NLE, New Learning Environment's main role with the inner city high school was to assist with the development of the model, which came out of the competition, and also to provide what they call as a translational brief, which actually guides the future users how to use the school, so it's like an O&M manual for the school. It's envisaged that also they'll assist with continued professional development of the new staff as they come on board, which will actually be really important. So this takes me to my first question. What has been the catalyst for the emergence of this new technology? And what's the relationship between the pedagogical methodologies and the built environment, and what ultimately does a future-focused school look like? Following our theorists, we look at the classic diagrams, which I'm sure you may be familiar with, of the development of schools across generations. So going from the traditional classrooms of the 19th century through to the open plan of the 1970s. I do actually recall I went to one of those schools. To classrooms with linked shared spaces, which there's a lot of schools which have this model currently now. And actually the schools in Singapore which we were working on had this model. And then now looking at this new future-focused model, which is looking at providing a series of sort of multiple types of diverse spaces which a range of teaching and learning activities can occur within. So really it is moving from these traditional cells and bells to these very fully flexible spaces which very importantly are technologically enabled. That's a very important point. It's important to understand what the next generation is. An interesting comment from a recent conference I went to is that our learners of today will touch not only the 21st century, but actually the 22nd century. And if you think 2 centuries back, what the world was like then, a child born in 2018 will actually be in their early 80s in 2100. And, you know, what is 80? It's probably 50. So it's actually a really different world that these kids are going into. How do we equip future learners who'll enter this world which is rapidly changing? And the majority of jobs have not even been thought of yet. There's a great website which it's worthwhile looking at, the Foundation of Young Australians, and that actually puts it really quite succinctly. You know, research is saying that young people will have 17 jobs over 5 careers throughout their lifetime. I'm probably a bit of an anomaly. I've had only about 3 jobs and I've been in one place for almost 25 years, but a lot will have this sort of constant movement of careers. Recent research identifies there needs to be a new framework of learning because the jobs will actually require this sort of enterprise skills. This new skill set will have a focus on collaboration, creative thinking, critical thinking and communication. So how do we design spaces which can meet these needs? What types of spaces or technology need to support teamwork, problem solving, communication skills, digital literacy, presentation skills, critical thinking, creativity and financial literacy? Recently I was at a user group session at University of Technology in Sydney, and one of the DVCs had an interesting observation. Talking about the university moving more and more towards a highly collaborative learning model, she was encouraged by a recent comment by a science lecturer who had observed that it was entirely necessary to change the method of transfer of information. What he said was that the information that the science lecturer was required to teach was changing so rapidly that facts were outdated constantly. The previous teaching methodology of teaching facts is now redundant, and the only way to engage in a meaningful way with the students is to work collaboratively to develop strategies and methodologies for problem solving, critical thinking, innovation and creativity, which I think is entirely relevant to how our students are learning today. This is actually a great image of the original Cleveland Street Public School, which is on our site. Our site actually has a collection of 3 heritage buildings. This is 1909, when it was a primary school. It does have quite nice the pot plant touch of biophilia coming in. It's still a consistency today. And this is what we now see as images of future-focused learning. The one on the right is one I think a lot of people are familiar with, which is the Ørstad Gymnasium in Copenhagen by 3XN, which really pushes these boundaries of new ways of learning. The outcome of all these criteria of creativity, critical thinking, etc., that we need to design spaces that are flexible and adaptable. They can either be opened up or they can be enclosed. They can have the capacity to change character through different furniture settings or servicing requirements. In the context of the inner city high school, we tested these ideas with a cross-section of stakeholders, as we didn't actually have a community yet. From across the Sydney region, there were school principals, administrators and teaching staff, and also students who are currently exploring different teaching and learning methodologies. And in many instances, they're actually doing this in entirely traditional surroundings. This actually enabled us to develop a specific educational model coming out of the competition. And this model then sets up a framework which can be further manipulated once the new principal comes on board. These stakeholders were really our greatest resource. Although they were not always spatially literate, they do have a deep understanding of what they might need to facilitate these new ways of learning. Also, as educationalists, they were actually great communicators, and so they're very open to have this exchange of ideas with their peers. So what we had is a series of sort of day-long workshops with a lot of discussion about topics that NLE facilitated, talking about how we could mould this new model to education in New South Wales. The interesting thing as well with a model is what you have is, I suppose, these new ways of learning, and then you have the structure of the old Board of Studies, so NESA, which is actually our HSC requirements. So how do you actually align those two? We actually spoke to stakeholders who are experimenting with alternative models, such as Jane Heath from the Australian Science and Maths School at Flinders University. And she there has a curriculum which from it's years 11 and 12, I think, and it's actually project-based, and it challenges how the South Australian matriculation works. So it's actually looking at not doing the standard subjects, but actually doing it all as a sort of project-based model, which does actually work. We also looked at benchmarks globally. Many of the examples globally that Charlie mentioned are multi-levelled due to contextual constraints, and they haven't necessarily explored new models. Some have, some haven't. I think Australia is actually quite unique in what education's doing at the moment, because we are not only exploring this new typology of high-rise buildings, but we are inserting into it this new future-focused way of learning. And actually, I think in the next 5 years, there'll be a number of really, really interesting benchmarks, which I think the rest of the world will actually be turning to. We've already got schools in Victoria, there's ones in construction in South Australia, and then you've got your Brisbane one as well, or Brisbane 2, which are coming up now. I think with all of these schools, post-occupancy evaluation will be critical, and it's actually one of the key assumptions of our educational model. We also look towards other typologies, the contemporary library, a typology which is adapted to the needs of the digital world and the ongoing importance of the library as a community hub, which is not dissimilar to a school, and also the workplace, where flexible work practices are demanding new ways of working. So look, our model looked at a number of key assumptions and recommendations, which are the framework that the school will move forward. So learning is predominantly transdisciplinary and project-based. The timetable should explore options such as longer periods across the week. Co-teaching is expected to take place at the Inner Sydney High School to take full advantage of the range of spaces provided. And also what we're doing is we're providing resource nodes in each learning hub. The timetable will be a staggered start, so there'll actually be staggered break times for middle and senior students, and that really is to control the movement through the multi-levels. And also what we'll have is 3 types of staff workspace. We'll have fixed workspaces for the staff, which is for specific specialist staff. We'll have a central workspace, and then we'll also have staff touchdown points and learning hubs. And as I said before, that it's really important that there's both pre- and post-occupancy professional development, so that the teaching staff can understand how to operate in a co-teaching, project learning, flipped learning environment. And they'll actually start doing that as soon as, I suppose, the new principal's announced. They'll start employing their staff, and then they'll start sort of working within this new practice of teaching, which many of them are actually doing in current schools at the moment. And another interesting fact from the Foundation of Young Australians, that coming off their website, they're saying only 1 in 10 teachers have recently participated in professional development to help their students develop these new skills. So that's something that we'll have to be very mindful of. Our model is based around a series of specialist and generalist learning hubs. So essentially what you have is a floor plate, which within it the student can remain for virtually the whole day, or maybe over 1 floor plate or a couple of floor plates. So we have a series of different spaces. We have open learning areas, which are actually timetabled spaces. We have general spaces, so seminar rooms, smaller meeting rooms, and presentation spaces. Presentation spaces are acoustically sealed spaces for either very noisy or very quiet work, and that's where you might have, say, a period which is an instructional lesson, for example. We always have a connection to outdoor learning areas. That's very important. And then we move from within the hub from general to specialist learning, and so that's where you might have your labs, your design studios, or your workshop spaces. And the way the hubs are constructed, they go from sort of quiet spaces through to the noisy spaces, which is obviously the outdoor learning areas. This takes us to the second question of how we can provide a flexible framework for learning whilst responding to the reality of a highly constrained site and the pragmatic requirements of a large, complex building. This is where we can start to apply the ideas of the first question onto the site, and really, which is really the domain of the architect and a place where we do feel most comfortable. To us, one of the fundamental aspects of any new building is the acknowledgement of the importance of the sense of place and a belonging to the site, the contextual environment. And this is really important in the context of a community school. The site for the inner city high school is actually quite unique. Since European settlement, the site has always operated as a school, with the first building being an ironclad building which was built in 1856. And then subsequently they then built a series of buildings. There was 3 heritage buildings in the site. This is the building 1 and then building 2. And then there's another one which now sits in front of this one. The site also is an archaeologically significant contact site. There's a first contact, which means that it hasn't actually ever been excavated, some parts of it. And actually a waterway ran through the site which fed into Blackwater Creek, so it would have been potentially a camping ground for the Indigenous population, or at the very least it was a pathway that took clans down from Botany Bay down into Darling Harbour or to the harbour. So we actually went through a fairly extensive archaeological program on the site as well. The site's located on the edge of Surrey Hills. It's both a local site, but it's also it's a city regional site. So it's visited by people who both belong to the area, but also it has people passing through. So just up to you can actually see in this image, you can see where Central Station is just up to the top of the screen. So it was actually quite important for us to understand what this essentially transient population, what that means to a school sort of sitting on the edge of that. We're really fortunate to have Prince Alfred Park, which actually surrounds the park, and over the whole, I suppose, life of the school, there's been a relationship with the sharing of this resource of the park, and there's been an agreement with the Department of Education signed with City Council to have a shared resource between the school and the park. Our response was to create a campus to break down the elements into a number of clearly identifiable parts. It was very important that the landscape terraces related to the park. We then had a studio volume, which is where we have our art and design and technology areas. We then have what we call as the veranda, which looks over the city, faces north, and that's where we have outdoor learning. And then the learning hubs, which are to the south, which look over the suburbs, which the school will be serving. I've just got a conceptual animation here, which just gives you a sense of the scale of the elements and their relationships to each other within this campus. We very much saw the site as being a campus of buildings, and it was quite important that we broke down the scale of what is a very large building on a very constrained site. So this is where the site is placed. It's actually placed on a major arterial road, Cleveland Street, so it does have a fairly significant acoustic constraints as well. So this is a site before the 1969 building, which has been now demolished. So that's this building here. There's a couple of very significant fig trees as well on the site, which we have to be mindful of as we're placing our new building. So then this is the idea of bringing the park into the school. So you have this really strong connection with the landscape, and that's something which will be incorporated into the curriculum as the students move through the school. These landscape platforms are actually where all of our public areas are located as well. There were some quite beautiful spaces in the existing campus, so they're being enhanced and retained. So there's like an amphitheatre, for example. The heritage buildings, it was really important that we gave them the same respect as the new building, because they operate a part of this campus as a whole. So our new building, I suppose, is very mindful with its form and its articulation that it actually followed that, the rhythm of the heritage buildings. Views through to the park from the lower levels, and especially upon entry from the school from Chalmers Street, which is the other road which you access, the main access to the school itself. The movement around the lower levels is horizontal, and you're always accessing the heritage buildings through the new building, and that was to provide us with accessible access throughout the whole campus. On top of the new building, there's, this is the outline of the original planning envelope, which we were given basically a box to plan within. What we did actually choose to do is set back the tower form, and that was really to provide a lowering of the scale of the surrounding context, and also to provide light and air for the adjacent apartment buildings, and then also to bring light into the basketball court, which is located on top of the studio box. This is where you see the veranda, and then we have the hubs that will come in behind in a sec. What we did is we created a forecourt off Chalmers Street, looking at the existing context. It was quite important that we framed the heritage buildings behind with the studio and had quite a, I suppose, a quiet elevation. And then this is the two boxes which come in. So what we have is three floors, then a terrace, and then 3 floors. Because this site is, it is vertical, it's really important that we do have adequate outdoor recreation area. So what we did is we inserted in a number of open play decks throughout the floors. There's vertical connection within the learning hubs as well, and that enables the students to move maybe just between 3 floors in a day. And here you see the upper level play deck, and then we've also got one up on the roof as well, and there's a rooftop garden too, which they'll use for agriculture. So that just gives you a bit of a sense of the massing. You can just see there the glimpse through to the park. I mean, the interesting thing about this building was that for the Department of Education, it's a new challenge for them, because they will now have to basically maintain what is essentially, similar to a high-rise commercial building with the systems that you need. So we need to have, facade maintenance, we need to have robust facade materials. They actually have to have a maintenance strategy which is in place and done. So that's actually been something which has to become part of this our return brief back to them. Within this contextual framework, the question is how can we design for flexibility which could last for another 100 years? One of the interesting aspects of the existing buildings is that due to their generosity of space, they've got incredibly high ceilings, they've got large rooms with large windows. This photo we took at about 6:30 in night a couple of weeks back, which actually let in abundant light. So interesting enough, these old buildings are actually quite adaptable. So we're doing minimal demolition to them, and we're actually managing to insert our new model within these existing forms. So then specifically looking at this question of how can spatial planning developed out of a set of educational and design principles provide an appropriate framework for a school which can be adapted into the future. There's a number of fundamental givens which are consistent to any school design which is future focused. A clear and direct wayfinding, inclusiveness, safety and security, visibility, so visibility of the learning and also visibility of what the students are learning, so that's looking at things like writable walls. A clear identifiable entry, a connection to the public domain and a strong connection to the community. And also the essential provision of expandable and adaptable services with actually a focus on communications so we can constantly adapt to the ever-changing world of information technology. Our model can be distilled into a simple diagram. The building is 14 stories tall, plus the roof. But as I said, the typical day of a student will only be across a few of these levels, with the majority of the movement via staircases. And this is where the adoption of the educational model will be fundamental, and also the ongoing engagement of the teachers to understand how the learning environment can actually work in this way. We did test the school with a traditional model, and it really does rely on the future-focused learning to work. So what we essentially have is the lower levels are where we have our student-focused areas, and also the large gymnasium. We actually chose to sink the gymnasium into the ground. We're just now coming out of the havoc that caused with regards to insight services. We then have a large play deck located on level 1, then above that is suspended the studio box, and then above that is the general teaching hubs. So the campus is divided into a series of key elements. We call all the lower levels the village campus, and that's essentially the podium, which has landscape terraces and the heritage buildings. As I said, the movement complex, which is a gymnasium and associated teaching spaces, like there's a sort of a dance studio, is located in the basement level. The heritage buildings are completely connected into the new building, and access is always from the new buildings. Outdoor learning and recreation is scattered throughout the whole school. After we'd actually done, I think, or maybe it was during schematic design, Department of Education announced that every child had to have 10 square metres of external play space, which we do just have with our current scheme, and we now completely have, we have a shared relationship with the park, so they will be using a part of the park when they actually reach their population of 1,200. The studio, and then finally the learning hubs, which are divided into 3 blocks. I'll just take you through in a little bit more detail some of the areas, and just to sort of explain how the model works. So the campus, the lower levels are divided into a series of hubs. So we have the Welcome Hub, which is really what you would traditionally know as the school administration. The Student and Community Hub, which includes the Resource Centre, so the library. It also has the Deputy Principals are in there. The IT Help Desk, school counselling, and also things like the school cafeteria. And there's also a lot of spaces which are student-led spaces, which the students can have it for their own to do things like workshops or group work, that type of thing. These levels are also where we've got our community engagement. So the idea is that all of the lower levels will always be accessed by the community. This is something that once the principal's on board, they will then work out exactly how that will work. But essentially we have Building 3, which is our performing arts building, is potentially able to be accessed. Also the large gymnasiums, and then potentially, we might even go further up the school depending on, the preference, I guess, of the principal and the school community. So this is looking at the main entry level, which comes off Chalmers Street, and here we had we did actually indent and I suppose almost gave back a bit of land to the city. We actually had quite an interesting approach to our boundaries, and we ended up having this sort of blurred boundary between the park and the school. So some of the land we gave back to the park, some we actually took over for our access into our building, just around the edges. So essentially on this level is where we have I suppose the main student focus level, overlooking out onto the park. And the idea is that as you come in through the school, you get this great visibility through to the landscape. So this is just a view looking across into the park beyond through the resource centre. A series of stairs take you either up or down. The idea is that the students will circulate predominantly by stairs up to probably up to about level 2 or 3. We do have 4 lifts plus a 5th lift, which gives a public access down into the basement. The 4 lifts, however, will be on destination floors only, so the students will actually arrive at the open learning areas. So they arrive at the level 2 basketball court, or they go up to the next level, which is a large open terrace, or they go up to the rooftop, and then from that they then move down into their learning hubs. Level 1 is a large open play deck. So this was something which actually wasn't in the original brief, but we managed to manipulate the areas to create this very, very large undercroft space. Really vital in this school that we had enough outdoor recreation area, because as you can see, the site is incredibly constrained. This is where we also have the cafeteria as well. Going down, this is the park side. So this is looking out from Prince Alfred Park. So here we have the upper level of the gymnasium, and this is where you'd envisage the main public access will come in. And here we have a whole series of quite diverse outdoor learning spaces as well, which have been created with the existing spaces around the heritage buildings. And then the movement court down the basement and the movement studio, plus supporting facilities. So you can just see here with this section how we do have this sort of connection through from Chalmers Street down to the park. We do have the advantage of this change of level, so we actually could use that to our advantage and create this, I suppose, a series of spaces which look into each other, because I think one of the most important things about these types of schools is the students are always aware of where they are, and they can always also identify, I suppose, where their special place is within the school. So the studio is essentially a very large and flexible teaching volume, and it has an interconnecting stair. So you access this from the public student areas. So in terms of plan, essentially we have on the left-hand side is where we have our sort of more general learning areas. So there's a collection of presentation studios, open learning, and also seminar rooms. And then on the right-hand side is where we have specialist workshop areas. So our current plan is showing the design and technology, or the TAS spaces. But the intention with this is we actually have a fairly flexible construction in that over the whole end of that building we have a double slab, so they can actually change the configuration of those rooms as they need to. We're working with them at the moment, just trying to understand sort of, I suppose, moving forward into the future, whether a wood workshop and a metal workshop are actually relevant, or it's something that we should be looking at changing. We also do have specialist spaces which are giving us 3D printers and things as well. So hopefully that's the direction that we'll start to move in once the new principal comes on board. We have a large outdoor terrace where we currently have the outdoor equipment, and that's also used as a learning space. The next level up is where we have essentially visual arts, and that's again a range of different types of learning spaces. And they're connected by a large stair which can also be used as a presentation space. So then moving up into the learning and community hubs. These are essentially smaller floor plates, so they're more seen as connected, flexible teaching and learning volumes, and they have interconnecting stairs and also voids. So the idea is that potentially, you know, maybe a grade 10 student could spend their whole day up in, you know, one of these hubs. The brief was actually developed through the lens of STEM. So what we actually do have is each of these hubs does have a science lab attached to it. We also have the majority of our presentation spaces or actually all of our open learning spaces, the majority of our presentation spaces have a maker space which is attached to it as well, which is essentially I suppose an area which has got water, it's got I suppose appropriate workspace for doing things like making, cutting, that type of thing. So they're scattered throughout the whole floor. We have, on the lowest level, we have a food technology space, which is probably the only hub which is not a general learning hub because of its very specific nature. With this school, we had 3 sort of special streams that we could look at, and it was seen by the stakeholders that food technology was quite relevant to the demographic which we were in. So we had performing arts was another one which we have in a sort of an expanded brief on. So this is our typical learning hub. It's about, I think it's about 850 square metres, so it's actually quite a small floor plate. And that was driven by, I guess, by the constraint of the site, this very dense site, and the, I suppose, this sort of very strong contextual preference not to overwhelm the site with a massive building and to really respect both the park and also the heritage buildings. So what you have here on this sort of typical floor, you have on the veranda space is an outdoor learning area. You have a science lab, and the idea is that the science lab can actually all open up to the outside, the doors can all slide back. We then have in the centre the open learning, and that will actually accommodate 2 groups of 30 kids. We have presentation spaces. The idea is that which are the enclosed rooms. The idea is that the presentation spaces can actually open up into the open learning, or they can shut down, and they can either be one large room for 60 or 2 smaller rooms for 30. We then have in the purple is the resource node. Essentially what the resource node is little mini libraries which are scattered throughout the tower, And so again, that reduces the need for the students to move all the way down to the resource centre down on the ground level. So they've got specific material which would be located up on these levels which they're occupying. Similarly, we have the staff touchdown space as well, and then we have small interview rooms and seminar rooms which support the learning with if they need to have one-on-one instruction, for example. So essentially what will happen is that the teachers will move quite freely around this space, as will the students. Sometimes they can be in a traditional mode. You might have 2 classes operating in traditional mode, and then you might have another 3 classes that are operating in a more flexible future-focused mode. So in that respect, it was quite important that the model did have this sort of element of transition in it, because we're gradually, I suppose, moving into this new way of learning. When the school starts, it'll start with, I think it hasn't quite been decided yet, but potentially just year 7, and then the years will build up. They haven't yet worked out how the years will build, whether they'll bring in years, like upper years, and build up from year 7, or they'll just build up from year 7. But that's something that will be worked out in sort of the coming months. So at the very beginning, the school will have ample space, and then as the school starts to be occupied, they'll have to learn how to use these spaces with more and more students. So that will be an interesting exercise in management as well, I think, for the principal. Throughout the school, we've got these whole number of active and passive play spaces, and I think they're a really important part of the learning model. And also one of the sort of parts of the brief that was given to us by the Department of Education was this desire to use the building actually as a learning tool, and so to really understand, structures through the building. So we're working through with HY at the moment, thinking of ideas of how we can actually incorporate this idea of building as an anatomy through the scheme, and that could be things like informatics. It could be exposing structure. It could be demonstrating, structural diagrams. It could be looking at how we use solar. How the sustainable features operate. So as I said, we're now in the construction phase. And look, before I end, I would like to actually acknowledge the consultant team. We had a pretty large team. We went through it was a state significant planning development, so we had the raft of consultants who helped us get all of our reports together. And also the Department of Education, who have actually been an incredibly exciting client to work with. The PRG that we work with are very engaged with actually making this work. And I think we all feel as though this is very much a project which is breaking new ground. And I think predominantly it's actually breaking new ground from an educational point of view. So it'll be really interesting to see how it evolves over time. And NLE will come back with us and do some post-occupancy to understand sort of how this, I guess, what we've done can then inform schools of the future. Look, ultimately, we're designing a building which will be inevitably inhabited, and it will change by the people who use it. It actually has, internally, it has actually changed quite a lot since our competition brief. I think our approach to design for this building has really been informed by the educational model, and that's really much, there is a contextual overlay, but I think we were, I suppose, very cognizant of the fact that we are actually designing a building it's a school, it's for students, it's not for architects. And look, the success of this school will really depend on the continued engagement with the teaching staff, and how they do actually begin to work with this more diverse range of teaching spaces to enable the students to reach their full potential. Thank you.
We have about, 15 minutes for questions, but I wanted to say thank you. I really thought that was very interesting. I like what you said at the very end about using the building as a tool and exposing structure. I think all high school students need to be aware of bending moment diagrams and shear diagrams. So before I open the floor to questions, I have one, and it might be silly, but Does this new typology challenge BCA classifications in any way, or?
No, it doesn't actually. It's very similar to a tertiary building. Yeah. So, I mean, we did actually draw a lot upon looking at university high-rise, and look, we have a fire engineered solution. Yeah. So, but look, it's pretty standard. It's actually fine. Look, the only thing that we had to be really mindful of is I think the original, I suppose, spatial allocations didn't necessarily allow for the extent of services you actually need. Yeah. So the big smoke exhaust coming up through the tower. So that's something that everyone should always be mindful of when you are planning these types of schools, that you do have to actually acknowledge that it is a vertical building, and so there's all those aspects of the BCA that have to be brought into. Yeah. And look, the other thing with this building as well, because it's located on Cleveland and Chalmers Street, which are both really, they're quite acoustically challenged roads. There's some incredibly high sort of dB ratings at traffic lights. We originally wanted to have a naturally ventilated school, but unfortunately the acoustic constraints are such that we can't. So what we actually do have is we're using a full economy cycle to bring in fresh air. So we're trying to get the most out of it as we can. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that was a site selection issue. So we're trying to do what we can. And then hopefully as the school operates to the north, so in the veranda that you can see up there, we can actually start to open that up, so which would be good.
Yeah, so in such a high density traffic area, does that also affect pickups and drop-offs?
There is no pickup and drop-off, because it's a comprehensive high school. I don't think kids want to see their parents at that point. You get dropped off around the corner. Look, it's a local school, so it's really walkable. We have, we did as part of, we're targeting 4-star Green Star is the mandate from the Department of Education. We're also targeting to reach 5. As part of that, we have, I think it's up to 130 bike spaces, so the kids can ride their bikes, they can walk. Yeah, they don't want the parents to pick it or drop them off. But we do have, there's for kids that have got like an injury, we've got a little spot for that off Cleveland Street, but apart from that, yeah, they can walk.
Does anyone have any questions? Anybody?
Once the school becomes a great success, does that mean every school in Australia, for instance, all the GPS schools and all the great schools we have, will they have to be all redesigned, repurposed?
Look, I think it's very much about the school itself. So this is a direction which you know, the Department of Education in New South Wales are taking, and I know other states are going in similar ways. What we found is some of the other schools we're working with are looking at slightly different models. This is one specific model which has been developed, which is specific to this, I suppose, what the principles that New South Wales are looking at. I think there's a flexibility that you can have hybrids. There's still, you know, there's many different ways of learning. So this is just one way that I suppose Department of Education are exploring, and it seems to be very relevant to how the world's going at the moment. And yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see the outcome of the next generations as they come through. There's a lot of literature written about the models and what's good, what's not good. It's only time will tell. So I think it very much is this, I suppose this groundbreaking thing of what do you do? Will it work? Yeah, and it will work if you have that complete engagement, which. And I think we've done, I mean, the really great thing about this school is we could tap into this resource of all of the stakeholders of teaching staff who are actually doing it throughout Sydney in all sorts of schools. They're teaching in this way and use their expertise. So they've been doing that now for a number of years, but they've been doing it in traditional classrooms, which is really difficult. So we think, you know, the sort of the due diligence, I suppose, has been done on that. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it evolves.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Elizabeth. Before I ask Scott to come up to give a vote of thanks, just like to encourage everyone to consider a membership with the Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat for about $150 US. You get a membership with access to the CTBUH resources, video libraries, and literature, and the like. So please consider that. Otherwise, Scott.
Thanks, Charlie. Testament to, I think, how important this topic is and relevant it is to us here the preeminence of FJMT and, you know, their position in the Australian design landscape. This room is chock-a-block, and so much so that my seat, I couldn't see any of that presentation. I'm sorry to the side here that perhaps were challenged, but what it forced me to do was to really listen to what Elizabeth was saying. I couldn't rely on the sexy images that were up top, and I found myself really easily carried along the journey. And I think that's sort of a good proof that the articulation and the way Elizabeth presented the story behind how it got to be what it is was quite clear. And I think you could easily look at one of these vertical high-rises and not appreciate the narrative behind it and just think it's a horizontal school thrown into a high-rise. And that's not the case at all with Surrey Hill, certainly. So join me in thanking Elizabeth for a fantastic presentation this morning. Thank you.